One is, do insects like art? And the other one is, what do we value in artworks? So the second part of that is, do the insects appreciate it functionally? And the answer is we think yes. So we've done two pilot research projects, one at the Cornwall site and one at the Berlin LAS edition, which is at the Natural History Museum, the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin. So it's the entire forecourt is a living artwork now. And both those pilot research studies showed functional biodiversity improved.
Amazing.
We're now doing a major research project funded by UK Research and Innovation, this government research funding body, with Exeter University and Edinburgh University, where we've planted 17 what we call DIY editions, so editions that are made through the website pollinators.art. So 17 different residents have created a design and planted it in their gardens. We have 15 control gardens in the village, so people who've got existing gardens, and we have network ecologists chasing bees around the village, labeling bees. We have the residents in the whole village acting as citizen scientists, so they're doing pollinator counting. We also have social scientists studying the humans to see how they are transformed by the experience. So we're looking at how the insects are whether biodiversity is increased in these sites versus the control gardens, how the different planting style within here actually sort of improves biodiversity. And then we have a philosopher who is asking, what is a garden and who is it for? So it's really looking at not just the ecological benefit, but also the human transformation through thinking of a garden in this different way, about a
Uh,
place for other species before it being a place for humans.
hey, folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Our guest for this week is a follow on to our guest from last week. Dr. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg is an artist based in the UK who has a piece in the More Than Human exhibition at the Design Museum that our guest last week, Justin McGuirk, curated. That exhibition opens July 11, but if you happen to be watching this episode on YouTube or Spotify, you'll get a sneak peek of her piece in this episode. Daisy's art is multidisciplinary and examines our fraught human relationships with nature and technology. In addition to her work in the upcoming Design Museum exhibition, her Pollinator Pathmaker piece, which uses an algorithm to design art in the form of what we think of as gardens, but for the benefit of pollinators rather than humans, has been created for the Serpentine at Kensington Gardens in London and the Natural History Museum in Berlin. Other work of Daisy's has been exhibited at the Venice Biennale of Architecture, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Natural History Museum in London, the Cooper Hewitt in New York, and the Science Gallery in Dublin, among many other prestigious institutions around the world. She's also received several awards, including the Changemaker Award from Dezeen and the Rapoport Award for Women in Art and Technology from the Lumen Prize. In this episode, we talk about the overarching themes of Daisy's work, her obsession with exploring how we think about the idea of better, her Pollinator Pathmaker project, and a couple of her other projects, including one in which she created a digital version of a severely endangered rhino and resurrected the smell of a lost flower. We also talk a bit about non-human animal consciousness and the potential for creativity in making art, at least from the perspective of how we understand those terms. Make sure to visit pollinator.art to play with the Pathmaker tool yourself, and visit daisyginsberg.com to see more of her work and a list of upcoming exhibitions, which include work in England, Germany, and Scotland. And as always, if you enjoy this episode, please take a minute to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you're watching on YouTube, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Without further delay, here is the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with the artist Dr. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are really excited to be joined by the artist Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg. Thanks for joining us today, Daisy.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. So I really enjoy your art, and we just had a podcast with Justin McGuirk from Future Observatory, who's curating the More Than Human exhibit at the Design Museum, which you have a piece in. So I'm really excited to sort of dig into your work as part of our conversation around that exhibit. Broadly speaking, your art examines our human relationship with nature and technology. How do you think about the theme of your work, and what led you to pursue that field of research and artistic exploration?
I like asking questions. I think that's how I got to do what I do. And I'm very lucky to be able to do this. So I started out actually in architecture and then in a strange field of design called critical design, where we were looking at emerging technologies and their social, cultural, and ethical implications at the Royal College of Art in London. And through that, I really sort of cemented my practice being interested in what humans make and how we shape the world around us and the political values and choices and social choices that infuses the world that we make and then in contrast the world that we could make. So I love nature and I was again lucky to grow up in the countryside in the UK and be immersed in the natural world and have access to it. And through, I guess, a very contrasting training, which is in humans recreating the world through design, through architecture, the built environment, and all the products and things we make, really led me to this sort of examine this paradox. And the world that we live in today is so focused on the new and creating and innovating rather than protecting what already exists. And that disconnect is part of the remnant of sort of Western modernity and Enlightenment thinking and dividing the world into two, nature versus culture. And it's completely divorced from reality, which is that we live on a planet with an ecosystem that supports us. And so destroying what already exists is incredibly problematic to innovating a future where we can live comfortably. So it's that sort of tension that really interests me between essentially humans and nature, and humans, if we put them in the bucket of we and humans being very many different peoples and societies, but sort of this modern way of thinking and being which separates us from nature. And it's that framing of the world that interests me so much, and what I focus on in my work.
I love that articulation of that tension of us being a part of that ecosystem, influencing these ecosystems that we're a part of, but also them influencing and supporting us. And to take that in the design space, I was watching on YouTube a recording of your talk from the Dezeen event in 2019, and it was titled "Designing a Better Way." And you highlight in your talk how better is used to sell everything from pizza to sort of rival design ideologies. But you ask, what do we actually mean by better? And so how has this question of what do we mean by better, this pursuit of better, how has that sort of informed your work? And do you have a different version of better, what better means now, or a better version of better for what
I
your work means?
became obsessed with this word. I actually wrote my PhD about it because I was hanging out. I spent about 10 years hanging out in the anthropological sense and in the social sense with synthetic biologists, so genetic engineers who are manipulating biology for human benefit. And I don't have a science background, and I'd learnt about this new field or this emerging field, which was really a new approach to genetic engineering. The way synthetic biologists sort of describe it is genetic engineering is sort of an art form, whereas what they were doing was rationalizing it, making it more like an engineering discipline. So standardizing DNA code, making it programmable, and so really treating living matter as a machine. And it's such a techno-utopian version or approach to living matter that we can solve humanity's problems just by re-engineering living matter. At the same time, I was sort of immersed in a way as an outsider, as an artist in the design community. And the same rhetoric exists in design, which is that design makes the world better and each thing we design is better and promising a better future. And I began to kept on hearing this word and thinking, does it mean progress? And progress has a set of definitions, and it is a sort of philosophical approach that we are constantly improving, and that humans are on this uptick. And sort of, scholars like Steven Pinker is one of the main proponents of this vision today. But it is also, again, an Enlightenment idea that we, through knowledge, can emancipate ourselves from the natural world. But the more I thought about it, better is not the same as progress. Progress does have a set of sort of a value system, or at least a measurable, which is, how far are we emancipated? How far are we in control of our world? How much are we not affected by disease or poverty or, domestic violence, all these different measures. But the real measure of progress today is actually gross domestic product, which doesn't take into account human well-being or environmental well-being. And then you look at this word better, and everyone is using it to sort of mean progress, but it doesn't mean anything at all. And then I realized that the people who are promising to make a better world all have a different idea of what better is. And the questions I began to ask were, well, what is better, and whose better is being delivered, and who in each case gets to decide? And that's really a political question, a question rooted in power and economics, and also individual visions. So I was looking at different visionaries and how they realized their view of the world through coalescing people around them. So every time you see a pizza advert that says, our pizza is better, or I mean, the more you start looking for it, the more you see it everywhere. That became sort of a slight obsession to collect, because you realize that I don't know what a better world is, because better is completely subjective. Better for me in the long term is different from better for me in the short term. I'm hungry, I'll go and buy a sandwich in a plastic, wrapper, and fulfill and sate my need to survive in a very first world way in this moment. And for others, short-term survival is the absolute imminent risk. But then there's also this longer term sort of idea of what is a better world. And although there are many people today who disagree, I'm very strongly of the view that protecting the environment and our ecosystems is the thing that underpins all of the other stuff, the short-term survival and long-term survival. But that long-term survival is becoming increasingly a short-term risk through climate collapse and ecosystem degradation. So I don't have a definition of better. My view is we should probably all be taking that longer term look at things, because the short term keeps us alive now, but actually long term is like 5 years away, 10 years away. It's not some distant future for our survival. So it's a very long-winded way of saying I don't know what is better, but I have a strong feeling that protecting the natural world is absolutely essential to a vision of a better world.
Yeah, and I love this articulation you just had, that better is essentially subjective, and better could mean different things to different people, and better for a pollinator looks different than better for a human in certain cases. And so that kind of leads us into this tension that is highlighted in your piece, Pollinator Pathmaker, or the many editions of this that now exist, because it is very much a localized creation where you use this algorithm to design art spaces for the benefit and pleasure of pollinators, rather than a garden for humans, which is designed for our own needs, whether they be aesthetic or growing vegetables or whatnot. Might also have benefits for pollinators in terms of we plant certain things, but, we have imported all sorts of plants and things in our gardens that aren't necessarily supposed to be there by the design of nature. So when you think about that Pollinator Pathmaker project and reconsidering better and designing it from the perspective, using an algorithm to design it from the perspective of the pollinator versus the human, what are aims there? Like, is it to help develop empathy for humans in terms of we can think differently about this? Like, how did that project come to be, and what are you hoping to get people to think about?
So I think that good art should transform us. That's really what I, as a sort of storyteller, I'm trying to ask questions through the work that I make and to tell stories and enable us to see the world in a different way. So Pollinator Pathmaker was meant to be a sculpture. It was the original commission from the Eden Project in Cornwall in the UK, which is a kind of botanic garden, but not in the colonial sense. And it's more of a sort of environmental showcase. I think it's not even the right word for it. It's has a lot of outdoor space filled with plants, and they wanted a sculpture. And I said, a sculpture about pollinators. Why don't we make a sculpture for pollinators and actually use, the resources that we have to bring attention to the crisis facing them, whilst actually engaging with the pollinators themselves. So pollinator numbers, we're talking about bees, but also moths, wasps, ants, beetles in the US, hummingbirds, elsewhere bats, and some mammals. Are pollinators are essential so plants can have sex. Some plants can be wind pollinated, but other plants need an intermediary to come and remove the pollen and take it somewhere else. And this is a problem if pollinators are in decline. You can't have sex if you're a plant. So I proposed making a living artwork instead, and I had to think about, well, what is an artwork from the perspective of a pollinator? Do insects even like art? And if they did, what would it look like? And it took me into this sort of deep dive into many different threads, and perhaps the starting point was, well, what do pollinators see? If they see an artwork, what does it look like? And I began to learn about the field of ethology, so where scientists are studying the animal experience. And in one case, one scientist's work I was looking at from Exeter University, studying insect vision. So he takes photographs and has built software to simulate how a bee may see a flower. But of course, we're then looking at that reproduction that's in human colors to simulate another insect's colors, because we can never get into that world. So we may see a red flower, but to a bee, the equivalent would be blue, because a bee can't see red, but they can see ultraviolet. So the structural color looks, creates a different perception of a plant. When you're then looking at a field of flowers, all the colors are different. And then if you're a bee, for example, you don't see depth in the same way. You can see polarized light. You're perceiving the world completely differently. So this led me to this question, well, if pollinators design gardens, what would humans see? And how can the artwork help flip the normal way we see the world and to actually allow us to experience empathy for other species? And really it's a question, can an artwork do that? How do we get into that, the ability to see from another perspective? So I created this algorithm that would design these gardens. That seemed like the logical thing to do, because if I'm designing a garden, I'm going to make it look nice for me. I can make it pollinator friendly, and that's a very good thing, and we should all be doing that. But in this particular instance, I wanted to remove all my aesthetic decision making as the artist. So I worked with horticulturists to build this first, what we call plant palette, so a database of plants, and we researched which pollinators visit every single plant in that database. We know when they bloom, which garden conditions they like to live in. And then the algorithm is what I called an empathy algorithm. So it is trying to solve for empathy. And that is an irrational thing to do, because it's an emotional state. And how does an algorithm, you're an algorithm when you're coding something, you have to have a top level problem to solve. So in a way I had to say, well, what does empathy mean for me here? And that could have been a number of things. And I decided it would mean diversity. So diversity of insect species. So this algorithm is then selecting and arranging plants, and it creates a unique planting design every time it runs. And it is arranging them specifically to solve for pollinator diversity. So you can play a little bit with the algorithm. We have a website, pollinator.art, and you can have a go. And you can play a little bit with the parameters, like the number of plant species included. And whatever you do, though, you can't choose how it looks. It will deliver you a planting design with a plant list and instructions to plant it that solves for insects first. And it was this attempt really to test if we can make a technology that doesn't put ourselves first? Can humans create things that are not primarily for us? And of course, supporting insects supports us directly. But it's really also about transforming the viewer of the artwork, which is normally the human, into the caretaker of the artwork. And here, the users of the artwork are the insects. So if you are a gardener, you probably like to make a garden look nice for you or useful for you if you're growing vegetables. And that's what we're used to seeing in gardens. They are aesthetic or functional spaces. If you plant a pollinator pathmaker artwork, you are just there to to invest in it, invest your time, your labor, your money, and space. So whether you're planting it at home or in a school, your job is to look after it and keep it alive for the other visitors. And that is a transformational moment, especially if you're an experienced gardener and you freak out about losing control over your decision-making process. They seem to be the experienced gardeners of the group that gets really challenged.
Yeah. This opens a lot of questions. So one that immediately came to mind is you've done this in a few different places. I believe Berlin, and it started the Commission Eden project, and then Serpentine may have done it other places. But this question around what does a pollinator perceive when they look at this, and like we're using the term art. That might not be a thing that exists in the world of pollinators. Maybe it does. We don't really know. But when we think about like the success of art from a human perspective, people line up to see the Mona Lisa, or they clamor for tickets to see the latest exhibition at Tate Modern or something like that. And that is like, oh, people are attracted to this. They want to see it. It makes them feel something. It makes them think about something. Do you have any mechanism with the different, like across the different editions, to like assess of like, do the pollinators find this more or less attractive? Like, did we do something right? Did the algorithm do something right? Like, is there any sense of, were you successful in creating art for pollinators?
So are pollinators even conscious is sort of a starting point. So one of the scientists I spoke with when I was developing this is a professor called Lars Chitko, and he's based at Queen Mary's in London, and he studies bees, and he's written a book called The Mind of the Bee. And I went to his lab, and he has bumblebees playing with balls. So his argument and his view is that insects are conscious, and there is another view which is that they are more like automata, they're like little machines. But he, in this particular experiment, which I found so fascinating, is not giving food reward to the bees. They're just having a nice time in the way that we can anthropomorphize them, what is nice, playing with a ball, just having fun, rolling around a ball. So, what is the pleasure we get from looking at, say, the Mona Lisa or a sculpture or any other art form? It's aesthetic, but what is aesthetic? Why do humans have an aesthetic sense? What does that even mean biologically? That's a kind of a question I keep on asking neuroscientists and evolutionary biologists: is why do humans think things look nice, and why is it subjective? I don't know the answer. There are lots of different answers. And why do we get pleasure from it? So pleasure is that sort of dopamine being released. If you are a bee diving into a foxglove or a penstemon or any other flower that's filled with delicious nectar, and you get some pollen on you, maybe you're one of these insects that eats pollen as well, is that not an aesthetic sort of total immersion in deliciousness? Um, I don't know. There's a dopamine release when they're being sated. It's what would it be like to be like dive headfirst into your food, essentially, filled with the fragrant smell of flowers. I think we can only anthropomorphize that experience, but how much of that is, in a way, an aesthetic experience? So, I mean, again, it's an open question that I'm asking about this, and I don't have a scientific answer, but I think it's interesting to think about why we enjoy art and why, for me, it's important to call this an artwork as well. There's a number of different conceptual reasons. One is, do insects like art? And the other one is, what do we value in artworks? So the second part of that is, do the insects appreciate it functionally? And the answer is we think yes. So we've done two pilot research projects, one at the Cornwall site and one at the Berlin LAS edition, which is at the Natural History Museum, the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin. So it's the entire forecourt is a living artwork now. And both those pilot research studies showed functional biodiversity improved.
Amazing.
We're now doing a major research project funded by UK Research and Innovation, the sort of government research funding body, with Exeter University and Edinburgh University, where we've planted 17 what we call DIY editions, so editions that are made through the website pollinators.art. So 17 different residents have created a design and planted it in their gardens. We have 15 control gardens in the village, so people who've got existing gardens, and we have network ecologists chasing bees around the village, labeling bees. We have the residents in the whole village acting as citizen scientists, so they're doing pollinator counting. We also have social scientists studying the humans to see how they are transformed by the experience. So we're looking at how the insects are whether biodiversity is increased in these sites versus the control gardens, how the different planting style within here actually sort of improves biodiversity. And then we have a philosopher who is asking, what is a garden and who is it for? So it's really looking at not just the ecological benefit, but also the human transformation through thinking of a garden in this different way. About a place for other species before it being a place for humans.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. It reminds me a lot. A few episodes ago, we had Lucia Pietraiusti, who's the head of ecologies at the Serpentine, on. We got in about this animal consciousness thing, or more than human consciousness. After doing this work, you talked about the bee, and the researcher or scientist you were working with thinks that insects have some measure of consciousness as much as we can understand. Lucia was kind of leaning on the side of like, I'd rather give them more credit for consciousness and understanding things that we might also understand rather than less. After creating Pollinator Pathmaker, looking at these things like what is a garden, do you lean more or less on like assigning them more conscious things as we might understand them, or are you thinking actually no, I've learned enough that I think that it's not the same as what we have?
Well, I'm again not a scientist. I can only romanticize around this as an artist based on the work I do with scientists. But I would rather, I think it's self-centered to think that my kind of consciousness is the only kind of consciousness that matters as well. So if I were a bee, I might not think in the same way that I do, but a bee can do all the stuff that humans can't. So they can sense in different ways, they can navigate the landscape and optimize routes in incredibly intelligent ways. But it's about what we define as consciousness and intelligence as well. So the metrics are different. It's evolved differently. When I look at my dog, and he's quite similar to me in terms of, he is a dog, but he can be trained. He's more like me than a bee is, but I would say that he's less intelligent than me but with a bee, it's such a different species. My dog is really not very intelligent. I love him very much, but I wouldn't. There are many dogs who exhibit more intelligence than mine, but a bee is existing in a completely different, part of the animal kingdom and has evolved differently, and it may be that we just need to think about it differently as well. So if I see a bumblebee play with a ball, I can anthropomorphize that, and as a scientific experiment, it's the hypothesis is that bees will do things that aren't functionally important. They have to learn how to navigate into certain kinds of flowers, and they will then tend to visit that kind of flower afterwards once they've understood how to access it. But playing with a ball without a food reward, the experiment is looking at, is it part of that training process or is it just fun? I actually have something from the lab here that just happened to be on my desk, which is painting by bees.
Wow.
So this is from, you can't quite see the colors on camera, but the doctoral students in the lab allow the bees to walk through some food coloring and then create what they call art on this paper. So it's the footprints of the bees. And I don't know, is that art? I was so fascinated by it. I bought it from the lab. I was like, I'm the artist and I'm buying artwork from the scientist. And yeah, is it art? It's not. I see it as art because it's conceptually interesting and it's beautiful. But the bee is just walking around and happened to walk through some food coloring. But then you see an elephant painting. Um, I don't know. It's different strokes for different folks,
Yeah,
maybe.
that leads me on to another part of the conversation we had with Lucia. So, sort of the theme, the question at the center of a lot of her work is the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish, and it's based on this pufferfish that I'm sure anyone who's watched a ocean documentary has probably seen. This goes to the ocean floor in the sand, like stamps out with its fin and its body this circle pattern, which might remind a lot of humans as art that they've seen or art that they've seen created. And it asks this question, kind of like you're talking about the bees in this painting, is like, is this art? Is it not art? Like, could a bee actually create art, at least art as we perceive it? It's a really fascinating thing. I'm not sure I have an answer yet. Again, I think Lucia probably leaned more towards the we should give
I
them the
think
room to do that.
yeah, art creation, you know, so a honeybee makes hive, that's functional. Like the danger is anthropomorphizing, and part of Pollinator Pathmaker is an attempt to encourage imagination and empathy by allowing us into their world. But anthropomorphizing is not necessarily helpful. So do a weaver bird making a fantastic nest,
Mm-hmm.
the more beautiful your nest in the way we describe beautiful, the more likely you are to get a mate. But it's functional. I don't know. So whether the insects, I would argue this is not art by insects, but it's art for me because it's conceptually very interesting. Whether a bee can make art, but can they enjoy it? That's a different.
Yeah.
They do appear to enjoy the large superabundance of food that we present through Pollinator Pathmaker.
Yeah. I know a lot of companies, artificial intelligence companies, are working on trying to figure out how to understand different non-human animal languages and communication. I think that might be the first question I ask is, do you understand art? Do you have a different word for it? Do you analyze it in a different way? Because that feels like so intrinsic to what makes us humans that if other non-human animals are able to have art, whether it looks like ours or not, that feels like a big shift in our understanding.
Oh, we're getting very big. We're like, what is art? What I know about art is that this gives me an aesthetic pleasure.
Yeah.
Like it's releasing dopamine, I guess, in my brain because I'm looking and I think it looks nice and I think it's really interesting and it makes me want to look at it again. And there's something in that set of sensations that means I keep it on my desk and look at
Yeah.
it. I describe it as, you know, as art. But I don't know if you could say I don't know if I would describe it as art by bees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So on Pollinator Pathmaker, we mentioned that you've got some work that's in the upcoming Design Museum More Than Human exhibit. Can you talk about the piece that you have there? I believe it's a tapestry, and sort of how you thought about the theme of the exhibition of More Than Human and More Than Human design.
Well, behind me on the wall, for those who are watching the video and not listening to the podcast, those listening to the podcast, I will describe it in words, is a section of the tapestry. So I'm in my studio and these are some samples that have not been seen before. So I
Wow.
hope it's okay that it's happened to be on the wall behind me. So this is an 8 meter tapestry that I'm creating as a little section behind that is depicting an unrealized Pollinator Pathmaker edition. And I say unrealized because it is a utopian proposition, which is I created a planting scheme for the forecourt of the Design Museum in London, which is currently a large paved area with a few beds and some trees. And I propose ripping up all the paving and planting a living artwork across this very large space to prioritize the more than human rather than the human. So there are small paths for humans to access the museum, each a yard or 2 yards wide. But maximum amount of space is given over to the living artwork and the existing trees remaining. They have not yet agreed to dig up the forecourt. So I have presented an argument for this living artwork in the form of a tapestry. So this it's 8 meters by 3 meters, and it takes us through the seasons of this living artwork from the perspective or the imagined perspective of its insect visitors. So it starts with spring, goes into summer, autumn, winter, and then back into spring again. But the colors, and you can see behind me, don't look normal. Some of the plants are purple. And this is because I have created what I call a pollinator vision filter and applied it on to the imagery. And I mentioned at the beginning that bees, for example, can see the color red, and butterflies. Oh, so bees can't see the color red, but butterflies can, and both can see ultraviolet. So there's not a uniform way that we can say this is insect vision. But the idea is to give us this discomforting sensation that the world is not as we're used to it. The tapestry itself is also, the flowers are scaled up very big, they're like a foot across. And the idea is as we approach this piece of work, this sort of soft piece of textile, we are enveloped in the flowers. The colors are very bright, the flowers are distorted and huge, and we become an insect approaching this enormous feast of flowers in front of us. So the tapestry itself is a different way to present a digital artwork. Pollinator Pathmaker, the website where you can make your own, is a digital tool. But within that, I have painted every species that appears in our plant palettes, and you can fly through like an insect through a visualization of the potential garden that you could plant. So the tapestry is using that visualization tool to present this different perspective on what could be if they dig up all the paving, which I understand if they don't, but it goes to the root of the dilemma we face about preserving and looking after the world versus what the world that we have chosen to make that excludes habitat for the species that support us.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think I'd sign that petition to rip up the pathway. But looking forward to hopefully people seeing it and reacting to it and having the same sort of reaction of wanting to create space for this. So that's some of the work that's upcoming. I do want to go back a little bit to touch on some of your earlier projects. One of them, Resurrecting the Sublime, set out to bring back the smell of an extinct flower, which, you talked a little bit about synthetic biology, like really interesting that this is even possible. But in the video about the piece that I watched, you asked this question of, do we deserve to get a glimpse of or sense of something we've destroyed? It's just sort of that question of like, just because we can, we should. Do we deserve the ability to smell this extinct flower?
I don't know. I mean, so I made a few pieces around this idea of the reconstruction of lost nature. Another work is called The Substitute, and the third in the suite is called Machine Auguries, which reconstructs birdsong. And The Substitute is a reconstruction of a northern white rhino. So there's only two females left of this subspecies. The last male died in 2018, and you may have seen it in the news. He was called Sudan, and it was front page and then gone from our minds. And there are a lot of news stories continuing about the northern white rhino because there are efforts to bring back the species using biotechnology. So IVF, with eggs harvested from the last two females and using sperm from the last males before they died. And then also through more sort of radical stem cell technology, where scientists at UCSD are trying to create new sperm and eggs based on the larger collection of stem cells from a larger population. This is really the problem, and the same with flowers and Resurrecting the Sublime, is the environment and the social environment are part of the issue in the extinction problem. So we could bring back the northern white rhino if this technology works and the embryos are successfully gestated in southern white rhinos, and they would give birth to a northern white rhino. But what is the point? of having a few more northern white rhinos if there's not enough genetic diversity to sustain
Hmm.
the regrowth of a population. So these become sort of toys. They're models, they're icons that represent our desire to, fix stuff, but it's actually not fixing the root cause, is that rhinos continue to be poached in huge numbers. There are only 2,000 southern white rhinos left. There's two northern white rhinos left. And I'm smiling because it's the absolute reality is that this is a social and economic and political issue. It's one of regulation, it's one of commerce and legal trade in the centuries before of rhino horn, and the demand and people who need the money to survive fuels this industry of poaching. So bringing back a couple more, they just become like living exhibits. They're not functionally the species. That's my view on it. At the same time, if we can do it, should we? It may give us the chance to be able to bring back a population. In this case, these rhinos, their habitat does still exist, and they're a crucial part of those ecosystems. For the flowers in Resurrecting the Sublime, their habitats are gone. So each of those three flowers we looked at, one was a hibiscus from Hawaii, one was a protea from Cape Town, and the third was a scurf pea from Ohio. Each of these flowers, their habitat was lost generally through colonial action. So South Africa, this protea just grew on this one hill in a specialized microclimate, and that hill is now suburbs. But it became vineyards before it was suburbs when colonists went into Cape Town. And in Hawaii, American cattle ranching that came to Hawaii in the early 20th century destroyed the lava forests, and that was the habitat of this hibiscus. So trees went, and that was a specialized ecosystem. So in the case of those particular flowers, it's an example of how you could just bring back a species, for example, if we could, but it negates the ecosystem aspect of it. A species doesn't exist in isolation. It exists as part of a system, and it contributes to that system. And other species rely on that, and they may have disappeared because that particular flower they pollinated has gone. And biology is a dynamic thing, and evolution is dynamic, and species change. So we go much further back in the de-extinction story, in terms of the timeline of animals that are being proposed. You may have heard about George Church and his woolly mammoths and his
Hmm.
argument, we could bring them back to fulfill the function. These would be kind of hybrid mammoth elephants to fulfill the function of the mammoth. Um, these habitats and ecosystems are are connected in the same way we think of, I don't know, a piece of plastic as an object is actually the history of the oil and all the life before that became that oil that then became that plastic thing, and then that plastic thing goes back into the ocean or landfill and becomes particles somewhere else. There's a brief moment where it's coalesced into an object, but the rest of the time it's a bunch of other stuff interacting with other things. So thinking of things in isolation, I think, is part of the strangeness about a human approach to conservation, which aims to reconstruct species without thinking about reconstructing ecosystems, environments, and the social framework required to sustain that. So bring back the rhino. Where does it live? Who looks after it? What happens to its progeny? How will they be looked after? It has to be kept under lock and key. It's not a wild rhino.
Yeah, I think I had the same thought with the woolly mammoth. I was like, okay, so you're probably just gonna have to put these things in zoos, because we'll have to care for them in a specialized way because their habitats, their environments, their food sources don't exist the same way they did when they were walking around. So
And also, everyone is going to want to poach these things
yeah,
because they're going to be so special.
yeah, no,
I say
it's
everyone, that is not true. There are people who want to poach. I would not want to poach a woolly mammoth. but they will become these rarefied objects. And
Yeah.
the idea of herds of wild, genetically engineered, or the products of incredible science, don't I'm not negating that in any way, but as an ecological solution rather than looking at the hard, boring, difficult work of social solutions, I think is looking at the problem in from the wrong direction.
Yeah. So we have gone through a lot of really big questions that I think listeners are going to have a lot to think about. To kind of bring our conversation to a close, we talked about how your art broadly examines this human relationship with nature. Technology is a big part of that. Where do you sit now on your own relationship with nature? Has it changed through having to sort of bring different perspectives into your worldview? Like, have you noticed a shift at all? Or is it just sort of, this curiosity that has been present throughout?
I am constantly blown away by the complexity of nature and all the things that are happening that we don't even think about. So the fact that, insects are navigating using polarized light, that a moth's wing beat washes the smell of the flower over its antenna in the same way that we sniff. The dynamics of that acts as a sniff. Like, these are all the most extraordinary things that exist everywhere and are completely invisible to us because we're not concentrating. Um, and the sheer diversity is just extraordinary. So I feel very panicky about preservation of our ecosystems, and Pollinator Pathmaker is not a solution, and it's not intended as a solution to the biodiversity crises or the pollinator crisis within that. But it is a tool for agency. So I feel
Mm-hmm.
immobilized by panic. As an artist, there's different things I could do. There are activists who are on the front line, there are policymakers on the front line, arguing their way bit by bit, trying to make a difference. But as just a regular person, I feel totally stuck. So in that role of mine, so as a citizen, I can vote. There's lots of different roles we all inhabit. But as an artist, I wanted to allow or to invite people to feel a sense of agency and to plant a living artwork and look after it. And if you haven't gardened before, learn by doing, and then to stare at a bumblebee's bottom sticking out of a flower and think of it as art. Like, that's just a different way of taking time to look, but also to have the tools to do. So planting one pollinator pathmaker artwork in your garden or at your school isn't going to solve very much. But if everyone plants one in a network, you're actually creating and connecting a landscape at network scale, and that's what matters. So recycling one plastic bag, it's not going to do much, but sort of giving us access to nature and creating spaces and giving tools for people to engage in a form of creative activism, say by coming together and planting at school and using it as a tool for lessons and for the kids to look after it, and just enjoy touching plants and learning to look after them, is transformational. And so much of that is not available and accessible in our urban lives today. So that's, for me, it's just sense of wonder and sense of panic at the danger it and we faces. And I say it, meaning nature, but we are part of it.
Yeah, I think that is the really special thing about the people, the artists and the people in the art world that I've had on this podcast is because they have, I guess, a heightened sort of awareness and empathy. There's a recognition of the challenge and a emotional reaction to that challenge, while also feeling some amount of agency to create and inspire and get other people to create and inspire. And then you look at this whole system of everybody getting really excited because they've been asked new questions, they've thought about new things. So I think that's why the art's so valuable in this conversation. Same with philosophers and some of these ethical questions we're asking about, is like, science can do something, but then you need to kind of, I think, have this other lens on top of it. So I'm really excited to see how people react to your piece. Hopefully, Design Museum will rip up some of their pavement to.
I don't want to put any pressure on them because it was never part of the
I'm going to
the
put pressure
deal.
on them. I'm going to
um,
email Justin right after this, and I'm going to ask him what the progress is.
so I've also made a provocation at the British Library, which is the main national library in London, and they have a very large forecourt, and I have made a video artwork for their exhibition that's currently on about gardens called Unearthed. And my proposition is to dig up the forecourt of the museum and replace it with a pollinator pathmaker. And in that exhibition, there's a video artwork that flies you through that living artwork through the seasons in the
Amazing.
forecourt of the library. So again, a utopian vision in that it is not likely to happen, but it is an invitation to think of a world that we can't imagine because it is so unlikely to happen. That this very functional building that could be transformed in that way.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Daisy, for taking the time to chat today. I'm so inspired by all of your work. It was really an honor to get a chance to chat with you.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I hope you'll be planting a pollinator pathmaker soon because we are creating some new plant lists at the moment. So I hope your listeners will follow us and keep with us while we make some updates later in the
It's
year.
it's pollinator.art is
That's
the
correct. So
website?
at the moment,
Great.
the plant lists cover Europe. So we have Atlantic Europe, which is UK, France, Belgium, so the northern swathe, where we have all have similar climate, and then the second palette covers continental Europe, which is sort of central France, Germany, moving across the center of the continent. But we have some new lists coming, hopefully later this year.
Fantastic. Everyone should check that out. And really excited to get this episode out to folks. Thanks again, Daisy.
Thank you.